Hey there, how there, ho there. It's Jeff Cutter Diamond. Welcome to yet another Cutter Top 10 video. And this one will be a recorded top 10 as I don't really want to show my face because of the situation that happened last night, well, early morning of November 2nd, 2025, because of the whole thing that will be explained in this list. Anyway, it got me thinking about the top 10 Toronto sports chokes of all time in the four major sports: baseball, basketball, football, and hockey. Of course, everyone knows that the NFL has never come to Canada, so practically, that doesn't count. But I mean, the Toronto Argos in the CFL, like, they were close to having no entries on this list. And I also thought about Major League Soccer, even though a lot of people don't count them as a major sports league, but I do. So technically, yeah, the Toronto FC club actually gets the chance to be on this list. There is one entry for the Argos, one entry for TFC, and the rest are basically basketball, hockey, and baseball related. It could have been a top 10 list, but I thought of a couple more. So it's going to be the top 12 Toronto sports chokes of all time. And of course, as I said, it's not all Leafs. There are Blue Jays and Raptors chokes in this list too. At number 12 on this list is the 2023 Toronto Argonauts. This is the one entry for the Argos. The reason why they're on the list is obviously the title card is that, the Argos won 16 games in the 2023 season, tied for the most in CFL history for a regular season team. And lo and behold, they did not get the Grey Cup, aka the CFL championship. They didn't even get to the Grey Cup final and all that. Kind of akin to the 2023 Boston Bruins, the 2001 Seattle Mariners. Well, yeah, and this 2001 Seattle Mariners, they didn't even get to the final, despite having the most regular season wins within their league and all that. So the Argos with 16 wins joined the 1989 Edmonton Eskimos as the team with 16 wins that did not win the Grey Cup. And like the 89 Eskimos, they didn't even make the Grey Cup final, as the 2023 Argos had been very sloppy and Montreal out defensed them to win the Eastern Championship and to go to the Grey Cup to face Winnipeg and beat them on a last second touchdown by Tyson Philpott. The Argos would get their revenge the next year by doing the same thing in Montreal, as Montreal was hosting the Eastern Final and basically trying to out defense Montreal's and win the Grey Cup. So, turnabout was fair play. At number 11 is a massive mistake by the 2007 Toronto Maple Leafs. The 2007 Leafs were just a few years coming out of the whole lockout, and all of a sudden, there was problems to be had and all that. The Leafs started to falter in a bit. They had a few good games and all that, but then all of a sudden, that Leafs had a chance to get the number 8 seed in the Eastern playoffs and face the Buffalo Sabres in the first round. It's always big with Toronto beat Buffalo and all that. But yeah, the Toronto Maple Leafs on the final weekend of the season had to beat Montreal, who also was chasing for that 8 seed. And they beat the Montreal. But then they needed the New Jersey Devils to beat the Islanders in any shape or form, even in a shootout. That will still matter, and the Leafs would have a tiebreaking face Buffalo. Unfortunately, New Jersey rested Martin Brodeur for Scott Clemmensen, and it didn't work out. The Islanders won in the shootout. Wayne Dubolitz was the hero as the goalie and all that. On a personal note, the next day was my 22nd birthday, and I got tickets to see Royals Blue Jays, the home opener, as a birthday present from my brother. Unfortunately, though, some guy decided to dress up in a New York Islanders jersey shown on the Jumbotron, and people booed the shit out of him. But yeah, this was a painful loss. This is akin to 1989 when the Leafs needed to beat Chicago on the final day of the season, but Todd Gill made a massive turnover and Troy Murray scored. So yeah, it's a choke in a sense, not to make the playoffs, but it could have been worse. At number 10 is TFC and the 2016 MLS Cup. Now, Toronto FC had been doing decently, but just couldn't make the playoffs. And then in 2016, TFC had a few good runs, and then we had to face their bitter rivals, the Highway 401 rivals, Montreal Impact, in the Eastern Conference Final. The winner got to go to the MLS Championship game. Seattle had won the previous day, but the TFC team actually made a furious home comeback to force extra time and beat Montreal to get to the final against Seattle. They had basically peppered former TFC goalie Stephen Fry with shots, but the Seattle Sounders keeper stopped all of them. They went to a shootout, and unfortunately, Seattle beat Toronto in the penalty shootout and won the MLS Cup in Toronto. The reason why this is actually ranked low on this list is due to the fact that TFC did get the revenge the next year. And, well, like the 2023 Argos, they got revenge the next year on the team that sabotaged them. So, yeah, TFC did win the MLS championship. So, gotta like that. At number 9 is 1985, 40 years ago. The Toronto Blue Jays choke against the Kansas City Royals. I know this could be higher, but there were bigger, higher stakes for the 8 teams above them. And no, of course, the CFL and MLS, nobody's there. So that's good. So the fact of the matter was that the 1985 Toronto Blue Jays were dominant. 99 wins in the AL East, finally winning the division and finally proving to America that Canada, they have a good baseball team. Led by many players such as Willie Upshaw, George Bell, Jesse Barfield, Lloyd Moseby, Dave Stieb, Jim Clancy, and Tom Hankey. The 85 Blue Jays won the division on the final weekend against the Yankees and went on to the ALCS against the Kansas City Royals. All they needed to do was win one more game. They were up 3-1 in the first best of 7 LCS. In the old days, that would have meant that the Blue Jays would have gotten to the World Series, but unfortunately, that's not true. The Blue Jays needed one more win, but they couldn't do it. They had 2 home games and they botched it, kind of like what happened 4 years later. But the fact of the matter is that Jim Sundberg's wind-blown triple off the top of the wall will always haunt Blue Jay fans and all that, even though the Jays have won back-to-back titles in 92 and 93, but that was humongous. The Blue Jays probably would have given St. Louis a run for their money. Maybe lose the World Series, but still. At number 8 is the 2025 Leafs versus Panthers. It ranks low on this list because of the fact of how the 2025 Panthers took care of the Leafs. But the Leafs needed to do this. It was their first division title in a non-shortened season since 2000. Yes, the Leafs won in 2021 what they call the Canadian division, but that was because of COVID restrictions and all the Canadian teams had to play in the same division. So technically, that does not completely count as a division title. And let's not forget the 2021 Leafs choked against the Habs. But they didn't make the list because of the fact that Johnny Tavares was hurt in game 1 and it was a COVID shortened year. So the Leafs basically, you knew they were going to falter. And game 7 was no help. But the fact of the matter is that the 2025 version of the Leafs won the division, took care of their eternal rival Ottawa Senators, and then took on the Panthers in the division finals. The Leafs had everything going for them. They were up 2-0. Anthony Stolarz got hurt by a hit by Sam Bennett, and a lot of people said it was on purpose because he knew what he was doing to take out our best goalie. Florida would win 3 straight. Leafs needed to win in Florida in game 6, and they did, but in game 7, a choke job. 7-1 was the final score. It was the worst game 7 loss for a home team in history, and the Leafs had a chance to go to the conference finals, take on Carolina, maybe beat them, and then go to the Stanley Cup Finals against the Oilers. That would be one for Canada, but it didn't happen. At number 7 is the Toronto Blue Jays choke job in the 1987 playoff season. The 87 Blue Jays were a little different than their 85 predecessors, but they were still decent. The AL East was basically up in the air. Milwaukee had a strong start, but they faltered. The Yankees also had it was basically past the parcel for the AL East title. And the Blue Jays headed to the second last weekend of the season, had a golden chance to have it. In 1987, on the second last Saturday, on NBC's Game of the Week, the Blue Jays had a walk-off against the Tigers. And then the next day, they had a chance to sink the Tigers and all that. But Tom Hankey gave up a 9th-inning home run, and the Tigers won that game. Jays were still 3.5 up with 7 to play, so they had their destiny in their hands. Unfortunately, though, they completely choked. The Tigers did win the division on the final day in that 3-game series. All the Blue Jays needed to do was win 2 out of 3 in Detroit to clinch the division. Win 1, you'll probably go back to Toronto for a tiebreak game, but they did 1-0. Friday was a decent pitching duel. Saturday, the ball went through Manny Lee's legs, and then Sunday it was 1-0. Larry Herndon, the hero. And the Blue Jays were out of the playoffs. Of course, it was only 2 teams per league who could make the playoffs, 1 per division. Detroit would go on to get their butts handed to them by Minnesota in the ALCS and what might have been a Blue Jays Cardinals World Series. Maybe the Blue Jays win the '87 title, but it was one of the worst chokes ever. It's not really the biggest baseball choke because I know that the 1964 Philadelphia Phillies and the 2008 Mets also did massive choke jobs. At number 6 is LeBronto and the Cleveland Cavaliers taking care of Toronto. Toronto had a great 2017-18 season. They were tops in the conference, and it looked like Toronto was going to finally get over the hump. 2016, they made a nice run to the conference finals, but Cleveland beat the tar out of them and then went on to win the title against Golden State. What might have been a Toronto Golden State battle 3 years before it actually happened. So, anyway, the Raptors had a solid team, and then Cleveland had to face them. Cleveland had a 3-2 series deficit against Indiana, and everyone thought that the Pacers were going to shock Cleveland and take on those Raptors, but no, it was Cleveland. LeBron didn't just ruin the Raptors, he swept them as the Raptors were embarrassed as the 1 seed being swept by their lesser opponent. But the good news for the Raptors is that the next season they got Kawhi in a trade, even though they had to give up DeMar DeRozan, and then they ended up winning the title against Golden State. So they did have their matchup against Golden State, and LeBron went to the Lakers, which actually helped out because it weakened Cleveland and it gave Toronto a better chance to make it through the East and playoff round. So that's that. At number 5 is the 2002 choke of the Toronto Maple Leafs in the Eastern Finals against the Carolina Hurricanes. The 2002 Leafs ended up being 4th in the conference, facing number 5 New York Islanders, who were making their first playoff appearance in 8 years. The home team won every game. The Leafs won Game 7 on home turf, and guess what? They did it. So the Leafs took on the provincial rival Ottawa Senators, beat them despite being down 3 games to 2. They had to win Game 6 in Ottawa and Game 7 on home turf, which they did. Getting to the conference finals against Carolina, who shocked a lot of people by beating Martin Brodeur and the Devils in the first round, and then pulling off the Molson miracle when it looked like Montreal was going to have an insurmountable 3-1 lead in that series. Here's talking about Carolina. It was old school hockey, defensive scoring at its best. Urbe and Kudrow playing their hearts out, very low scoring. And then Game 6, the Leafs tied it with 15 seconds left to force overtime and hopefully score to force a Game 7 back in Carolina. But unfortunately, Martin Gelinas, as he was prone to do in his career, scored a massive overtime winning goal. Detroit would beat Carolina in the Stanley Cup final and it would have been big. I think the Leafs probably would have lost the Cup final to Detroit, by my guess. But the fact is that the 2002 Leafs had a chance to make it to the final. Martin Gelinas would go on to be a cult hero in 2004, scoring the overtime goal for Calgary against Vancouver in the first round, and then against Detroit in the second round, and getting the winning goal against the San Jose Sharks to move on to the Stanley Cup Finals, and should have had a 4th-game winning goal. But unfortunately, the puck was not over the line according to the CBC cameras. ABC said it was across the line, which was unusual, but that's what happened. At number 4, it's the 1993 choke with the Toronto Maple Leafs against it all in the conference finals. The 93 Leafs actually were much better than the teams from the past decade. The 80s were not a great time to be a Leaf fan for making the playoffs and winning playoff rounds. In 1987, the Leafs had a 3-1 series lead against the Red Wings to go on to the conference finals, probably getting slaughtered by the Oilers, but in a way, they're glad that they lost that lead. So anyhow, the Leafs aside, the 93 Leafs made some massive moves. They made that 10-player deal to get Doug Gilmour in 92, and they also picked up Dave Vanecek in 93, which was a gigantic move. The Leafs were going to be 3rd in the division despite scoring 99 points in the postseason. Chicago was the 1 seed in the division round, took on St. Louis and got swept. The Leafs had to go to Detroit. They were down 2-0, but they came back to win Game 5. Mike Foligno jumping in the air. Red Wings won in Toronto in Game 6, and then Game 7, Nikolai Borschevsky scoring off the tip of a Brous shot. into the net, and all I could say was unbelievable. The Leafs would take on the Blues in the second round. Doug Gilmour's wraparound goal in Game 1 in double overtime notwithstanding, the Leafs had to win Game 7 at home, 6-0, home alone. And then they took on the LA Kings with Wayne Gretzky. It was weird. Gretzky versus the Leafs. The Leafs would win Game 5 on a Glenn Anderson overtime goal, and all they needed to do was win Game 6 or 7 to move on to the Stanley Cup Finals against Montreal, who were already there as one half of the Cup matchup. Unfortunately, though, the Leafs choked in Game 6. Well, Wendell Clark did score the big hat trick to do it, but the Leafs choked in overtime. Everyone knows about the Wayne Gretzky non-penalty. I mean, Gretzky didn't have to be tossed. Gretzky could have just served a double minor or even a minor for clipping Gilmour. But Kerry Fraser said it was the follow through of the stick. Worst of all, Gretzky scored the overtime goal in Game 6, and then he had what many considered his greatest NHL playoff game ever with a hat trick and an assist for the Kings, taking out the Leafs 5-4 in Game 7 in Toronto. The Kings almost took the 93 Stanley Cup Finals, but thanks to Marty McSorley's stick, the Habs had the momentum. And it didn't hurt that the Habs won 10 games in overtime. But yeah, the 93 Leafs, that has got to be one of the worst chokes ever. At number 3 is the 2001 playoffs between the Raptors and the Sixers. Vince Carter was coming in his own. He was a superstar. He won the 2000 Slam Dunk Contest. Let's go home, ladies and gentlemen. Let's go home. And then the Raptors did make the playoffs in 2000, got swept by the Knicks. 2001, they improved themselves, got Muggsy Bogues and Nell Curry among other people. And Alvin Williams was coming into his own. Carter was there. No Tracy McGrady. He left for Orlando. But still, the Raptors did well. Faced the Knicks in the first round of the playoffs and won a critical Game 5. Now, of course, the playoff series before 2003 in the first round were best of 5, not best of 7. So anyway, the Raptors won the winner-take-all game in New York to face the Sixers. It was Iverson versus Carter. It was just TV viewing for both Turner and NBC. And the Raptors proved themselves. Carter put up 51 points in Game 3 in front of the American TV cameras. So Vince Carter knew what to do. And it was a 6-game battle. Iverson and Carter took turns scoring well. And then Game 7 happened on a Sunday afternoon. The game started at 5 Eastern Time. The only problem was the same day as Game 7 of that Raptors-Sixers series, Vince Carter had a graduation ceremony at North Carolina. He decided to go to the ceremony, even though that he could have easily had his diploma in the mail. So he went there. He didn't stay long, and then he got a flight back to Philadelphia and helped his team out, or tried to. The ball was in Carter's hands, went down by 1 with about 5 seconds left. Carter kicks a shot, boing, 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 no. And the Sixers go on to the Eastern Finals, and the Raptors lose. A lot of people blame Carter for actually going to that graduation ceremony, but Vince told them that he promised his mom he would be at the graduation ceremony when he graduated from North Carolina. So anyway, notwithstanding, the Raptors did get the revenge 18 years later in the second round again, as Kawhi Leonard took an off-balance shot when it went boing, 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 and then it went in. Game, series, Toronto has won, as Kevin Harlan would put it. The Raptors would go on to beat the Bucks and the Warriors for the title. I don't know if the Raptors. I think the Raptors would have beaten the Bucks in the Eastern Finals, but got their butts handed to them by the Showtime Lakers of the 2000s. But still, what might have been. Number 2 is the most recent jinx, and that was 2025 World Series. I know some people might put it low on this list, but I put it at number 2. I could have put it number 1 easily because, this was the final and Toronto was looking for a finals win. But the fact of the matter is that there was one choke that beat it. So anyhow, the 2025 Blue Jays were not expected to do well. People thought the Jays were not a playoff team. I thought they were a playoff team if they could just smarten up and all that. Picking up Anthony Santander off free agency, unfortunately, he got hurt. Bo Bichette was healthy for once until September, and he got hurt. The pitching staff was okay. Jose Berrios and Chris Bassett's injuries didn't help matters. But in September, with the Jays chasing for the AL East alongside the Yankees, Trey Yesavage came up, made 3 starts, and was doing pretty well for himself. The Blue Jays actually had a decent lead in the AL East and almost choked that away to the Yankees. Fortunately, though, the Blue Jays and Yankees ended up tied for first in the AL East, and the Blue Jays had the tiebreaker because they didn't do the 1-game tiebreaks like they used to do. And the Blue Jays beat the Yankees 8 out of 13 times in the regular season. That's why they were the AL East champion and subsequent #1 seed. So they got the bye to the ALDS, and who should they face but those pesky Yankees who beat the Red Sox in the Wild Card Series? Yankees took on the Blue Jays. Jays needed 4 games to take care of the Yankees. It was best of 5, of course. Then in the ALCS, the Jays were up against it. They were down love 2 and 3-2 against the Seattle Mariners. But the Blue Jays won Game 6-7 at home, and George Springer's 3-run home run in Game 7 in the 7th inning brought Toronto to its feet and got them to those World Series, hoping to be 3-0 in the grand scheme of things. They took on those pesky LA Dodgers, who were looking to go back-to-back. The Blue Jays split the first 2 games, lost Game 3 in an 18-inning marathon, but won Games 4 and 5, despite George Springer not really playing because of injury. So the Jays were up 3-2. Trey Yesavage had a few great World Series starts and all that. Game 6, the Dodgers scored 3 runs in the 3rd inning, the only inning which they scored a run. But it held up 3-1 as the Blue Jays got themselves into a 2nd and 3rd situation with no outs in the bottom of the 9th, but didn't capitalize. Ernie Clement, first pitch, he flies out meekly. And then Addison Barger does some too aggressive base running and gets caught off second base to end the game. Game 7, of course, happening just yesterday. And the Blue Jays were up 3-0. Bo Bichette went DB2, what can you do? But then the Dodgers hacked away. Jays were up 4-2 headed to the 8th. Max Muncy hit a home run off of Yesavage, coming in relief. And then in the top of the 9th, with a 91% chance to win the game, who appeared but Miguel Rojas, who was playing second base. And somehow, in some way, he cracked the ball over the left field fence. Gone. We're tied. We go to extra inning. Well, the Blue Jays had a few chances with bases loaded, but couldn't capitalize. And then in the top of the 11th, Will Smith, the catcher, not the relief pitcher and not the Fresh Prince, hit the home run to left off of Shane Bieber. And the Dodgers got a game-winning double play to win the series and send Toronto to 2-1 in the World Series lifetime, meaning that the fucking Florida Marlins are now the highest team by winning percentage in the World Series. 2-0 in 2 World Series they deserve not to be in. And finally, #1 is who can forget the 2013 choke of the Toronto Maple Leafs in Game 7 in the first round against the Boston Bruins. The 2013 season was strange because we had a lockout until January. And then each team would play 48 games. I don't think they played out of conference. I can't remember. But anyhow, the Leafs, for some reason, were doing decently. A last-minute game between Ottawa and Boston would decide Toronto's fate in the playoffs. Toronto finally got to the playoffs for the first time in the post-2005 lockout era. So anyway, Ottawa and Boston, that game had to be rescheduled because of the Boston Marathon bombing. Boston ended up losing to Ottawa, which meant that the Leafs had to play Boston in the first round and not Montreal. Leafs were down 3-1. It looked like game set match. I even thought Boston would beat Toronto. But then the Leafs pulled off a Houdini act, won games 5 and 6, forced a game 7 on a Monday night, the day before my target orientation. Leafs were up 4-1 and all that. It looked pretty good for the Leafs to move on to face the New York Rangers, who had beaten Washington in the other Game 7 on that night. Leafs then choked it away. Patrice Bergeron and company did their job and tied the game, forcing the game in overtime, in which Bergeron scored past James Reimer, 5-4 Boston. Boston would ride this momentum over the Rangers and Penguins to get to the Stanley Cup Finals, where Chicago got them in Game 6. It was a massive choke because the Leafs were up 4-1 with 10 minutes left. All they needed to do was hang on or even score 1 goal to ice it, and the Leafs probably would have gotten taken out by the Rangers, but at least they would have made it. But a 3-goal choke is akin to the 3-run choke the Blue Jays had. And I don't recall a Game 7 in which a team was up by 3 and choked. I know the Cubs in 2016 kind of choked that lead, but they still won the game, so can't count that. But yeah, the 2013 Leafs are the epitome of massive Toronto choking, and that's not good. Anyway, I'm Jeff Diamond. Adieu.